I have Kieran McAnulty, the Minister of Local Government and Emergency Management, with me today. Kia ora, Minister, and thanks for your time.
Kia ora, a pleasure.
In your role as Emergency Management Minister, what phase are we in with regard to Cyclone Gabrielle?
Well, in usual circumstances, my role would be to ensure that the government is providing the support required for the response and the recovery. Both response to a natural disaster and the recovery from it always remain locally led, but the government through NEMA provides support where required. And so in this instance, we have changed the structure slightly to reflect the fact that never before has there been an event which has crossed so many different regions at once. And so a Minister for Cyclone Recovery has been appointed, a Cabinet Committee has been established, and each affected region has a responsible minister to act as a conduit between the local response and the government.
Okay, and looking back at the initial response led by NEMA, are you happy with that?
I am. Again, the response remains locally led, but NEMA provides support to that.
Yeah.
And we were on the back of the Auckland floods, so the National Coordination Centre underneath the Beehive was already established and working at full capacity. We were monitoring the weather as it came in and keeping in touch with the local responses. One element of it was the unpredictability of it. In particular in Hawke's Bay, all forecasts suggested that there would be much less rain than was received. So that took, to some degree, the region by surprise. But the way in which it was able to respond as quickly as it did, I think is a credit to the region. I've spent a lot of time in Central Hawke's Bay in particular, and I've spoken to many locals that said that as the stop banks started to break, the local community, local civil defence and local council stood up to ensure that people were able to evacuate in time, and I think that's a credit to everyone involved.
Were you surprised that there wasn't more loss of life in Hawke's Bay and Tairāwhiti and Central Hawke's Bay as well, and what do you put this down to?
I think it's a miracle that there weren't more lives lost. It's an awful situation for everyone involved, and obviously our thoughts are with those who lost loved ones. But given the extent of the weather, the speed in which it arrives, the extent to which it exceeded all projections and forecasts, and the damage that it left in its wake, I think it's utterly remarkable that there weren't more deaths.
Now, you mentioned Central Hawke's Bay, which obviously is part of your, or part of it is part of your constituency as MP for Wairarapa. And that's almost a forgotten tale because a lot of the focus has been on sort of northern Hawke's Bay and that, but actually places like Porongahau and that were actually quite severely hit.
That's right. And what I've noticed is that the locals that I've spoken to, I flew to Porongahau on a helicopter. I've been in Waipukuro and Waipawa a number of times over the last month. I've spoken to a number of people that have been affected. What strikes me is how humble they've been and how their concern is directed at those further north that have been affected relatively more severely. I've reminded them that yes, that's true that there are others worse off, but they've still been impacted themselves. And obviously a lot of the media coverage naturally goes to the areas most affected. But there have been a number of areas that have still been hit hard, in Central Hawke's Bay and the Tararua district, for example. In fact, the damage has gone as far south as the southern Wairarapa coast, and also as far west as in Manawatu and Rangitikei. This week in Parliament, I introduced a bill which in part includes Manawatu and Rangitikei into the designated affected areas, because whilst they themselves did not get much rain, some of their rivers come from Hawke's Bay, and so they were affected as well in parts.
Yeah. And what shocked you about the cyclone, and from what you've seen going round?
This is the most severe weather event the country's ever experienced, and never before have we had an event which affects so many regions. What made it complicated was that the two previous states of national emergency either affected one whole region or the whole country at the time. This has affected a number of regions, all of which are in different stages of the response and recovery. So it's required a fair bit of coordination and oversight from government in order to understand where the need is, get the resources to where it's required. But what has shocked me is the utter level of the devastation and destruction. You see these images and this footage online and on TV, you hear about it on the radio, but it's not until you see it firsthand that it really hits home fully, and even then it's quite difficult to believe what you're looking at.
Now, you're also Minister of Local Government and obviously deal with councils and that, some of which are very small, like Wairoa and Central Hawke's Bay, large areas but small councils. How do they pay for this rebuild, and how much of the cost is going to be on there? I know the government is helping, but how are they going to afford this?
Well, they might not be able to. That's the unfortunate reality. So by holding both the emergency management and local government portfolios, I'm able to provide that perspective into the considerations for government support. You'll note that the funding that has been available to assist local councils have taken into account their capacity to pay. In previous disasters, we've gone along a 60-40 split when it's come to government assistance. But in the case of removing solid waste from towns, outside households, all the flood-affected material, we changed the criteria to say that once a council has utilised and depleted their budget for such work, that the government will come in and complete the rest of the bill. So it's definitely something that we're aware of and something we're factoring into our considerations.
Okay, one last question. Obviously, with the sacking of Stuart Nash, he was a vital component in the recovery operation, if you like. He was a lead minister for Hawke's Bay, you lead minister for Tararua and Wairarapa and that. What impact does this have, or is it just business as usual with Meka Whaitiri stepping into that role in an interim capacity?
Well, Stuart was performing a crucial role and he was doing a good job, but Meka Whaitiri is also a Hawke's Bay MP, and she has stepped into that role and has carried on with business as usual. I'll continue to support her as a local MP with part of Central Hawke's Bay in my electorate. Anna Lork is on the ground in Tukituki as well doing that work. And of course, the Minister of Cyclone Recovery has a good grasp of the needs of Hawke's Bay as we continue to report back on the development of the local response. So I have absolutely no doubt that the recovery stage and the work that's being done locally and the level of support that the government's provided won't be impacted by that news that Stuart Nash is no longer a minister.
Minister Kieran McAnulty, thank you so much for your time.